This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear from former U.S. Treasury official Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Remember to go to our homepage, where we've already had London metals trader Andrew Maguire, and what an incredible interview he gave. And we're earlier in the week, we had David Stockman and James Turk. But without any further delay, here is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Joining us now is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. He is the former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, and he's also the former Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Roberts, I find it fascinating sometimes the foresight that you have. You were the only person in the world that talked about Greece and the new Greek government getting close to the Russians. And here we are in the month of April, and we've got the Greek government officials meeting with Vladimir Putin, as you know, and it just astonishes me. How did you know that it would end up at this place, or what possibly made you dream up that scenario that's unfolding?
Well, Eric, it's really obvious because the demands that are being made on the Greek government exceed the capability of the Greek economy. And the result of the efforts to force Greece to pay off all of the debts without writing down any of it has been to drive the Greek economy down with austerity. All the austerity that gets imposed on Greece in order to allegedly free up government revenues for the German and Dutch banks and for the hedge funds who purchased the Greek debt at a bottom price when it looked like, Greece was finished and bankrupt. All of the austerity that's been imposed on Greece has driven down the economy. So the net result has been to raise the ratio of debt to Greek GDP. So the entire result of the policy of imposing austerity on Greece has been to make the burden of the debt even greater. Well, the former governments were all interested in being accepted in the West, paid off, taken care of, having comfortable bank balances in Switzerland or wherever. And they went along with all this notion that we'll drive the Greek people into starvation in order to pay the people who have speculated on Greek debt. This current government isn't willing to do that, or at least has not been so far willing to do that. And they understand that the debt cannot be paid 100%. Some percentage of it has to be written off such that the burden of debt on Greece reaches a lower level that they can pay or service. Well, the EU and the speculators who have bought the Greek debt, you have to understand that many of the people who originally lent to Greece no longer own that debt. They sold it off in hedge funds, and people bought it for pennies on the dollar, hoping to get rich because of the bailout. But Greeks can't pay the bailout, and so Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, who has been accepting indignity after indignity from the EU and Washington, lie after lie, sanction after sanction, he saw an opportunity. He said, look, come do business with us, Greece. And so the possibility is there now that the Greeks will simply default on the entire debt. If I was the Greek government, that's exactly what I would do. I would tell the West, look, you're trying to drive us into the ground to force starvation on the Greek people. You go to hell. We're not paying you one nickel. In fact, we're not having anything else to do with you. We're out of NATO. We're out of the EU. We've got our own currency back. And if we need any financing, our Russian friends are going to finance us.
Can you expand on that a bit, Dr. Roberts, how that will impact NATO, et cetera?
Now, this would begin the breakup of NATO, which is necessary if there's to be peace in the world. There can be no peace as long as NATO exists, because NATO is a mercenary force for Washington's wars of aggression. And without NATO, Washington hasn't any cover. If it's got Europe with it because of history, the white people, Europe and the U.S., have somehow appropriated morality. They represent morality. And the rest of the world represents tyranny and bad guys. Well, if they lose the cover of Europe, Washington is standing there alone, naked in its aggression. And so the minute NATO were to break up, all the wars would be over, and the threat of war with Russia and China would be over, because Washington alone wouldn't be able to pursue this type of enterprise. So Greece and Russia here is the beginning of the possibility of the breakup of NATO, because if the Greeks were to default on the debt, and it's mainly now, I think, owned by speculators and hedge funds, so that would leave Greece debt-free. It would have zero debt to GDP. And if they needed financing for some reason, the Russians could finance them. Now, if this happens with Greece, it's bound to happen with Italy and Spain, because Italy and Spain are in the same situation. They've got more debt than they can service. And the United States has been very active to make sure that the governments of Italy and Spain are governments that Washington controls, who will ruin their own people and their own country in order to pay off Washington and the New York hedge funds and the European big banks in Germany and Netherlands. But if Greece were to leave, then that shows the politicians in Spain and Italy that they can do the same thing. They can default and have a debt-free balance sheet, and if they need to have any kind of financing, they can turn to Russia and China or the BRIC Bank, which is now funded with $100 billion. And so what we see here possibly happening is that the greed of the West, the Western financial interests, the hedge funds, the EU, Washington, this greed to loot countries, even their own members like Greece, which is a member of the EU and NATO, could end up breaking up the empire. So I think we have to be very hopeful that this does occur, because if the empire can continue along the lines, we're now at the year 2015, 15 years into the 21st century, and the United States has kept the world at war. There's been millions of people killed, displaced, maimed, wounded. And now that they're running out of easy enemies, they're seizing on Russia. Well, Russia is not an easy enemy. And the Russians keep telling Washington, we're not Gaddafi. We're not Saddam Hussein. You mess with us, it's the end of the world. What are you doing? Don't you have any sense? Do you really want war with nuclear powers? Why can't you be intelligent? And why don't we work out these things diplomatically? And Washington doesn't hear. Washington just goes on about its business. If you look at the people in the Congress and this crazy Senator Cotton and all the rest of them, they're basically people committed to war with Russia. Well, that's not a war that anybody can win. And so I think that the Greeks are fortunate to have gotten a new government. I think the Greeks were silly not to have given the new government a massive majority. I think if they had given the new government a massive majority, that the Europeans would have made an adjustment in their demands. But since the Europeans are still determined to loot Greece for their own gain, the Greeks may turn away from Europe. And if they do, it will be the beginning of the unraveling of the EU, of the Euro, and, thank goodness, of NATO.
Yes, you were saying in your interview on January 30th, I'm just reading it here, that this would be the big chess move by Russia and China to get a foothold into Europe, because then the next dominoes to topple would potentially be Italy, Spain, Portugal, Ireland. Is this scenario a possibility now?
Yes, I think it is, because the Germans seem to be stupid. They're so determined to force the Greeks to pay debt that the country simply cannot pay without starving a significant percentage of the population, without just completely collapsing Greece into some backward third world hellhole. And I don't think that the Greeks are willing to do that. And so now that they have a government that's not an American-controlled government, I think they will look for a way out. These people who are in this Greek government, they're mainly young, they're idealistic, they're sincere, and they're intelligent, and they know that the Greeks can't pay this. It can't be done. And so I think that despite all the belief and propaganda that you have to be in the European Union and blah, blah, that the Germans are making it impossible for the Greeks to be in it. And so unless the EU and Germans and Washington come to their senses and say, look, we got to stop this Russian takeover of a NATO country, write off the debt or write off whatever percent is necessary that the Greeks will accept to pay the rest. If that doesn't happen, then I think you're going to see the prediction come true that the Greeks turn to Moscow. We're seeing similar things in Czechoslovakia, or the Czech Republic as it's called now. The Czech president was not long ago ordered by the American ambassador not to go to Moscow to celebrate the end of World War II because the Americans are busy at work eliminating the Red Army from the defeat of Germany. And so they have prevented Merkel, for example, the German chancellor, from going to Moscow to celebrate the end of World War II, the victory over the Germans. And they tried to prevent the Czech president. And he said, what, are you crazy? He said, but he liberated us. It wasn't you, it was them. And we were next in line to be exterminated after the Jews. And of course I'm going to go there and celebrate. And so now we have Victoria Nuland talking about how we got to have a maiden revolution in Czech Republic. So I think that this is spreading. And the Bulgarians, for example, they saw how their government, obeying Washington, nixed the Russian pipeline that would bring the gas in Europe through Bulgaria. And so what did the Russians do? They'd take it to Turkey, and now it'll come in through Greece. And they realized, the Bulgarians realized, the Americans bought our government. The government doesn't represent us, it represents Washington and the American corporations. And what is it doing, ruling us? So you're beginning to see these cracks and fissures, both in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. And so this whole thing could just blow up, and you could all of a sudden find that people decide that they're much safer having good relations with Russia than being American puppets.
Dr. Roberts, what about this Iranian situation? It's heating up, in Yemen. Everybody's getting involved. It's really a wild situation. It really is turning into the wild, wild west over there in the Middle East, and anybody with a brain has to be watching this and worried about World War III.
Well, the Yemen thing is because the Yemen people threw out the American puppet government, and Washington was disturbed and therefore went to Saudi Arabia and said, look, we've been giving you all these warplanes and everything. Now you go over there and attack Yemen for us. And so the Saudis did. I think it's a mistake for the Saudis because they have a very untested and unproven army, but the Yemeni are fierce warriors like the Afghans. And so the result of this could end up very bad for Saudi Arabia. But the Iranian thing is what's most interesting because it surprised me that Obama stayed in the negotiations long enough to resolve the problem of the Iranian nuclear energy program that Washington had created. There's now an agreement between Iran, and actually it was probably in many ways guided by President Putin of Russia and perhaps by the Chinese in the background. But there's now an agreement that Obama has accepted, apparently, that terminates the so-called Iranian crisis over their nuclear energy program. The Iranians have agreed to conditions that make it impossible for them to enrich uranium above the very, very low level that's used in nuclear energy. And they have agreed essentially to give up many of their treaty rights under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, they are a signatory to that treaty. Israel is not, and they have never violated it, or at least not for the last 10 years, according to our own intelligence services and according to the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors. There's been no diversion of enriched uranium to a weapons program. So this agreement basically undermines the many years of work by the neoconservatives and Israel, the government of Israel, to demonize Iran like they did Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and Assad of Syria in order to launch a military attack on Iran, because this now disposes of that issue. The question is Washington's word worth anything? The neoconservatives opposed to the agreement that Obama has worked out with the Russians and Iran claim that, we can't trust Iran, we can't trust them, they won't keep it, blah, blah. But, of course, the real question is, how can you trust Washington? What agreement has Washington ever kept? Well, they didn't keep any that they made with Gorbachev. Gorbachev agreed, the last Soviet leader, he agreed for the reunification of Germany, and in return, he was promised by the George Herbert Walker Bush administration that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. And promptly, Washington took it right to Russia's borders. Then Putin, you ask Putin, can you trust the Americans? The Americans pulled out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty that the United States had with Russia because Washington sensed a strategic weakness in Russia and said, let's pull out this treaty. We'll put ABM bases on their border, and this will degrade their strategic nuclear forces, and so they won't be able to withstand our orders, our pressure. We can continue to make Putin's Russia our vassal, just like we had Yeltsin's Russia as our vassal. Well, clearly Putin wouldn't trust Washington. Or go look at all of Washington's agreements with the American Indians, the indigenous people. There are hundreds of treaties. How many did Washington keep? 0. Not one. So what the United States is, it has a record, a history of never keeping any agreement it makes. It's the most unreliable government in the history of mankind. I mean, even the Romans, with all their power, usually kept their agreements, but not the United States. I sat down the other day and tried to think of just one treaty or one agreement that the Americans ever kept, and I couldn't come up with anything. Think about World War I. When World War I ended, Germany occupied other countries. It wasn't defeated. And the Germans agreed to the armistice because President Woodrow Wilson promised no territorial losses, no reparations. And the Germans were tired of the war. They had not started it. And so they said, okay. Well, then what happened? Every one of Wilson's 14 points, every promise he made them was violated. And then what happened? The British then blockaded and was starving the Germans into submission. The Germans were winning the war. And so the Germans were forced to sign the Versailles Treaty. And the Versailles Treaty took away large parts of Germany, gave some of it to France, some of it to Czechoslovakia, some of it to Poland, some of it to other places, imposed reparations on them that the most famous British economist at the time said will lead to World War II because of the greed of the West. And lo and behold, up comes Hitler. So you can ask the Germans what the word of American government is. It's worth nothing. It's useless. It's not worth the paper it's written on. And so now we have Iran. They've agreed to an agreement which is so one-sided, but which Iran thought was necessary in order to get out from under the sanctions and get out from under the threat of being bombed and having its civilians murdered and having all these casualties that the United States has inflicted on 7 or 8 countries in the 21st century. But is this agreement worth anything? So what does it mean? I think what it means is that the United States, the government in Washington, not the American people, they haven't much of a clue. The government in Washington is so determined to control every country that it's incapable of behaving honorably. It's so determined to tell everybody exactly what they have to do, including the Russians and the Chinese. It's going to get us into World War III. And this brings us back to the Greek discussion, and this is why it's hopeful that these young men in the Greek government will turn their backs on the West, which apparently sees Greece as simply something to be looted and plundered, and will open themselves to economic and military political relations with Russia and the BRICS. The BRICS comprise 40 to 50% of the world population and contain two of the three most powerful nuclear powers and the two largest countries. China is the largest in terms of population, and Russia, by far, is the largest in terms of landmass. And so we see the rise of these countries, and we see the loss of Western prestige because they continually lie, they continue to kill, they continually loot and plunder. And their view is that no one counts but them. We're the Westerners. We're America. Who are you? You're nobody. And that attitude now, the whole world has learned of it. The United States got away for a long time because of the Cold War, and the United States was able to portray the Soviet Union as the great evil and the evil empire. You remember Ronald Reagan's words, the evil empire. And they were able to demonize the Soviet Union and China and present the West as the white hats and all. But now the world's saying, no, wait a minute, the West is not white hats. Look what they've done. Look what they're doing to people. Look at this. Look. And so I think what we're seeing here is we're at a transformation point in world history where the United States has become too obviously evil. It's becoming obvious to people that it stands for war, and that it goes to war based on lies, and that the wars are getting worse, and that wars with Russia and China are not like wars with Libya and Iraq, and that the whole world is threatened. So what we may see coming out of this is the isolation of the United States as some kind of a deadly virus that's somehow got to be contained before it destroys life on Earth.
Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury and also former Associate Editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal. Thank you for joining us on King World News.
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Eric.
Be sure to tune in as we will continue to release interviews with the top people in the world throughout the week. Also, make sure to check out the King World News blog.